we'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Mark Baker. Dr. Baker has received a PhD in clinical psychology and a master's degree in theology, as well as a certificate in psychodynamic psychotherapy. He's licensed as a clinical psychologist and a marriage and family therapist. Dr. Baker has published numerous articles in professional psychological journals and has appeared on television and radio programs to discuss his ideas regarding psychology and spirituality. One of his most recognizable published works is the book, Jesus, the Greatest Therapist Who Ever Lived, which is also the topic of his speech today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Baker.
Bom dia. It has been my great honor to have gone to Brazil a couple of times, but I just learned of the Spiritist movement last year when Dr. Anceloni invited me to come to Maryland. It was my honor to speak there. So I am becoming newly educated in terms of the Spiritist movement. So it is my great honor to be with you here this morning to talk to you a little bit about my study and my understanding of the relationship between the teachings of Jesus Christ and contemporary psychology. My subject this morning is going to be on the subject of power, the personal power of Jesus. We're going to talk about that from a psychological perspective this morning. So if I knew the title of the number one book in the country, would you want to know what it was? If I knew the title of the number one best-selling book in the country for the last several years, would you want to know what it was? If I knew the title of the number one best-selling book in the world, don't you think you should read it? You think? It should be on your shelf at least, right? That's what we do. We have it on our shelf. We say, I've got it. Well, of course, that book is the Bible, right? It's by far the number one best-selling book in the country every single year. It's not on the New York Times bestseller list, but it is still the best-selling book in the country and in the world, by far. Well, I made that very comment on a website. I was asked to comment on a particular website as an expert because I'm a psychologist, and I happened to make this comment. It was in a spiritual section, and it really upset this woman that I'll call Amanda. She was very angry that I would trick people into trying to shove religion into a psychological conversation. And this was by email, you do these blogs online, and she emails back, and my statement was, the Bible is still selling like hotcakes. And she emails me back and says, I can't believe that anyone other than guilty priests or owners of sleazy hotels would ever read a Bible. Very angry. So we went back and forth, and I said, well, look, the Bible sells over 25 million copies a year in over 100 languages. If you're interested in spirituality, you might want to look at it. But we went back and forth. She would have none of it. And actually, those numbers are very low. The Bible sells many more than that. And said, didn't want to have anything about it. She was convinced her opinion of Christianity and the Bible and didn't want to talk about it. Well, then a few months later, I noticed, I kept checking back on her blog in the particular area of the site where she was posting comments, and she'd had a crisis in her life. A very good friend of hers, unfortunately, had died, and she found a Bible lying around, and she picked it up and started reading it. And she was putting in her website, I can't believe how powerful this book speaks to me. I can't believe how comforting this book is to me. Now, of course, I didn't say anything. I let it go. I didn't, told you so. I didn't do that. But I thought it was interesting. She didn't get it. She doesn't get the message of the Bible. But the Bible is extremely powerful, and it's extremely powerful still in people's lives today. No matter what you think about God or even Jesus, if you pick up the Bible, there are powerful, powerful messages in it for you. And that is why it is still the number one best-selling book in the world every year. And if you don't have a copy, you should. At the end of his life, Jesus brought his closest friends around him, and he knew he was going to die. And even though they had been with him for 3 years, listening to him preach every single day, they still thought he was going to set up a political regime and he was going to liberate the Jews from the oppression of that day. They were convinced that this guy had all this power. They'd seen him perform miracles. They'd seen him cast out demons. They'd seen him do all kinds of things that were so impressive. This guy was their answer. This Jewish rabbi was their answer. He was going to set up the kind of regime that the Jews needed to overthrow the oppression that they were experiencing at the hands of the Romans. And Peter, his faithful follower, said, even if I have to die, I will never deny you. I would die first, because we're going to change the world, Jesus. We are. Well, the soldiers came to take him, and you know what happened. Peter steps up with a sword, and he cuts off. He says, now's our moment. Here they come. Jesus, call the angels. We're going to beat these guys back. He takes a sword, and he cuts off a guy's ear. You remember the story. Jesus takes the ear, he puts it back on the guy's head, heals the guy, and he says to Peter, everyone who draws the sword is going to die by the sword. You don't get it. Just like Amanda, he didn't get it. I'm not here to try to control people. I'm not here to try to overwhelm them. I'm not here to try to get something for myself from them. That's not why I'm here. I have a tremendous amount of power given to me by God, but it's not to do what you think I'm going to do. So Peter and all the other disciples, when they saw this, they looked at him and they did the only rational thing that people could do. They ran away. But if you're not going to use all the power in the universe to control other people when it's needed, then what's the point? They didn't get it. They wondered. Jesus could have written the Bible himself. He could have appointed them as the leaders of his new regime. He could have set up clear instructions on how we should live. Think of all the unnecessary wars that would have been averted over the last 2,000 years, all the crime, all the poverty that wouldn't be here if Jesus had just done that, right? We'd all be happier and all be speaking Aramaic today. But he did not do that, did he? He didn't do that, and we are just still beginning to understand the brilliance in why he did what he did. Jesus did not use all the power in the universe to control people. Control is a form of power, but it's not the greatest form of power. There's a different form of power, a personal power of authority that's different from control. And through this power of authority, Jesus changed the world. And I want to talk to you about this morning. The personal power of authority that Jesus taught us about. Now, we hear a lot about the subject of power. Movies are made about it, books are written about it, songs are written, political campaigns are built on power. But I don't think we completely understand what power is. And yet we're negotiating it all the time and we want it. We want this thing, power. But what is it? Well, I'm going to refer in the next few minutes about the teachings of Jesus to help us understand power and understand the difference between control and authority. But I'm going to talk as a psychologist. Now, much of what I have to say, and when you talk about Jesus, you think about spiritual power. We can think about the kinds of examples I'm going to give you. You can look at them from a spiritual perspective. You can look at them from a human perspective. You can look at them from a psychological perspective. And I'm going to be speaking largely psychologically. I want to know how he was with other people because I want to know how I'm to act with other people. I want to know how I am to be as a person with other persons. And I think the best model for that is to look at the life of Jesus Christ. How was he with other people? How am I to conduct myself in my personal relationships with other people? What did he embody when it came to power? Now, I believe the spiritual truths of Jesus. I am a Christian. I believe what he said. I also can learn from how he was, whether I'm a Christian or not. You can look at his behavior and learn about what he believed and how he acted as a powerful person in the world. Now, let me give you an example to try to flesh out what I'm talking about. I'm going to tell you about a man named John. Now, it is possible to be in so much pain that you cannot put that pain into words. John was one of those people. John was referred to me after he was discharged from the military, having served multiple tours of duty in Iraq. He had seen what no man should see. He had done what no man should do. Horrible things that he'd experienced. And he's expected to come back into civilian life and just live normally, having done what he had done, having seen what he had seen. John taught me an interesting lesson. You know, psychologists think that when soldiers come back from combat, having seen things and done things, they think it must have been awful having seen what you saw. And that's not right. What's most awful for people like John, it's having done what he did and having to recover from that, having to live with that, having to adjust back into normal life, knowing that he could kill at any moment. It was a frightening thing to live this way. He drank excessively. He got into fights in bars. He rarely lost fights because of his training. At one time, there was a restaurant that he went to, and the valet brought his car up in a way that he didn't like, and he confronted the valet angrily, and immediately all the valets surrounded him. There were 6 of them, and he was spitting on one of them, hoping that they would fight him. He knew he could hurt each of them, and he believed he should be hurt by each of them. And he lived in this kind of nightmare daily. I wanted to help John, so I sought out consultation from a psychologist who specializes in working with people who have unspeakable pain, traumatized patients. So I went to her office and I said, here's a guy who's really traumatized. I need you to help me understand. And how she worked with people is sometimes people are in so much pain they can't tell you about it. So she has all these images around her office of things, objects from movies or houses or small toys. And she would say to them, look, pick some objects and tell me a story. And even with adults would pick the objects and they would act out scenarios in order to speak their pain out by acting out scenarios with these toys and objects. And I looked around the office and I saw Darth Vader and Superman over here, and I saw Jesus way over there all by himself in the corner. And so I said, well, so why is this? Why are Darth Vader and Superman over here and Jesus over there? She says, well, this represents power, and Jesus, he's just a benign figure, so he's over there. I thought, really? So that's what people believe. These are power. Power is having the strength to control other people, either by your wit or your brute strength. And if you're Jesus, you're just benign. That's not powerful. Power is controlling people. Whatever Jesus is, it's nice, but it doesn't really relate to helping people with power. Well, that actually helped me understand John. John was trying to power through his pain. He was trying to white-knuckle it through his pain by control. He was trying to control his feelings. He was trying to control other people. He was trying to Superman his way through his pain. But John made the mistake that most people make. You have a very limited understanding of power. Control is a form of power, but it's only one form of power. And it was not the form of power that was helping John at all. He was trying to control his pain with the power of control, but it wasn't healing his pain. It was only at best giving him temporary relief. You see, the power to cover over pain is quite different from the power to face pain. The power to cover over pain is very different from being empowered to deal with your pain. Turning to images of Superman is very different than turning to Jesus. And the power you'll get from each of those images is quite different. Now, I was never going to convince John to surrender control, and control itself is not a bad thing. Jesus controlled things. He, with miracles, controlled objects and substances. He controlled spirit. He used the power of control at times. The power of control is a legitimate power, but it's not the only power. And I think to Jesus there was a greater power on earth than the power of control. People used to follow him around because of his miracles, because he could control things. But he was always disappointed when they followed him around just because of his miracles. It's as if he would say, look, you don't get it. You don't get it. It's not about controlling things. Yeah, that's important and at times necessary to do. There's a time for us to control evil. Yes, there's time to do that. But there's a greater power that can only come from the authority of a relationship. Now let me speak psychologically for just a moment. In psychology, we distinguish between control and authority as forms of power. Control is the ability to force others to do what you want them to do. Control is the domination. Control is readily understand in images of Superman and Darth Vader. Oh, I get it. Darth Vader can control things from across the room. That's powerful, right? But authority is the ability to influence people in their hearts. Authority is quite different from control. Control, you can make people do things. With authority, you can inspire them to want what you want. It's very different from making people do what you want, is to inspire them to want what you want. Authority requires a relationship. That the greatest power exists on earth through relationships. Through relationships. Wealth, strength, intelligence, popularity, physical power or property, these things don't give you power in the sense of authority. They potentially make you powerful in the sense of authority, but authority is only experienced in the act of influencing someone else. It's a relational event of influence. In psychology, we call this distinction force versus power. Some writers call it hard power versus soft power. Some writers call it transactional power versus transformational power. And some writers call it control versus authority. Both are power, both are different. The science of psychology has changed a lot in the last 100 years. The science of psychotherapy, really psychoanalytic psychotherapy, is only a little over 100 years old. So we're a very, very new science. Plato is a lot older than that. So the hard sciences have been thinking about these things for a long time. So you have to give psychology a little bit of a break because we're brand new science. So Freud started us out with the idea that the doctor is in control. The doctor is to remain distant. He used what he called the medical model, but modeled after a surgeon. You come to psychotherapy and a doctor has the knowledge that you need, so he's in control, and he will impart knowledge to the patient, and the patient will use this knowledge to change their life, like a medical model. Well, about halfway through the last century, psychoanalytic thinkers began to change their thinking, and we don't think this way anymore. That's a power imbalance. If you come to me and I'm the doctor and I have all the power and you don't, and I'm going to give you information because I'm control, I'm going to help you get in control of your symptoms, that model is breaking down. About halfway through the last century, the president of the American Psychoanalytic Association was Dr. Heinz Kohut. Now, Heinz Kohut specialized in working with narcissistic personality disorders. I'm sure none of them are here today, but you probably know people who have a narcissistic personality disorder. Difficult people to work with, aren't they? He specialized in working with narcissistic personality disorders in his therapy. He liked doing that for reasons I'll never know. But this was his specialty. And he was using this power model that Freud came up with, that I'm in control, I've got all the answers, you come to me, and you lie on a sofa and I'll sit behind you and give you information over the sofa to you, but I don't even look you in the face. I don't need to. It's much like surgery. You're laying almost like a surgical table. This was the original model. Kohut did this for years and it didn't work. He gave up. He threw it out. And he developed an entirely new model that we now call self-psychology and has evolved into what we call relational psychoanalysis. That the contemporary thinking now is that it is not our expertise and our knowledge and our ability to control symptoms in other people that makes us healers. It's our expertise in facilitating a relationship that makes us healers. That Kohut revolutionized our thinking in terms of how we work in the room. It's our power of authority, the healing power of a relationship that heals now in psychoanalytic thinking, not the power of our ability to control. We enter into something that happens between us that gives us authority, healing authority in the lives of other people. This is a psychological perspective that was quite different from the one that Freud started us out with. Trauma, we now understand, is different from the medical model of trauma. I was seeing my physician a couple of weeks ago, and I had a bruise on my toe, and I showed it to my doctor, and he said, "Oh, that's trauma. You traumatized your toe." So medically, trauma is blunt injury, right? But from Kohut's perspective, no, trauma is something different. Trauma is not just blunt injury, but it's blunt injury that you have to deal with alone. Psychological injury is blunt injury, but it only becomes trauma if you have to deal with it alone. That becomes hell, where you're cut off. You can't make sense of the feelings. You have to wrestle with this alone. So healing, then, is what we now call, creating a relational home for pain. Creating a relational home for pain. That's authority. The power of authority is creating a relational home for the pain of others. I mean, think about it. You know of people sometimes raised in the same family, both of which had pretty difficult childhoods. And one of them grows up to be pretty much okay, and the other one is a mess. Or maybe you even know people who grew up in a pretty normal childhood, and they turned out a mess. And you're wondering, how could that happen? Well, I know that if you look at the life of the person who grew up, even in difficult circumstances, and you find that they turned out okay, there was someone there for them in their life. If it wasn't a parent, it was an uncle, or it was a family member other than that, or it was a Sunday school teacher, or a preacher, or someone else in their life that came alongside them and created a relational home for their pain. Someone who had authority in their life that only comes through relationship. Jesus taught about the power of healing through relationship. He came as a Jewish rabbi at that time, and at the time that he came, and still today, the most holy word for God, they're not allowed to even pronounce. We call it sometimes Yahweh or Adonai, but they're not allowed to even pronounce it because the name of God was too holy, too distant, too other. Jesus called Father Abba, which translated means dad. His view of God was a personal relationship. Jesus didn't teach from a distant and hand down his principles from some distant place. He told people, I have called you friends. He taught through the authority of relationship. In almost all the examples we have of the life of Jesus Christ in the New Testament, he's with people in their homes, at their parties, in the streets. He was with people, he was having a relationship with people, and this gave him the authority to speak into their lives. I believe that Jesus Christ is the greatest example of authority in all of history, and this makes him far from benign, far from the figure that needs to be over in the corner that we just turned to that's irrelevant for our lives, but actually the model for how to live the most powerful life possible. Now, in every session I have with John, I keep an empty chair in the room. I like to imagine Jesus sitting there. I like to imagine, what would Jesus say to John right now? What would Jesus want me to say to him right now? There are no images of Batman or Superman in my office. There's only an empty chair where I imagine Jesus to be. This is the image that I turn to. I think this is what John the Baptist meant when he said, he must become greater and I must become less. We must shrink our ideas of what it means to be powerful people and increase Jesus' idea of what it means to be powerful. I believe there is a power of authority that comes from God, and he meets us in our personal relationships if we ask him to meet us there. I think this is the power that transforms us. John is a lot like Peter, and he's still learning that all who draw the sword will die by the sword. He's still learning that. He was struggling to stay in control in everything that he did. But it was only by surrendering his need to be in control that he could experience the influence of authority in my relationship. After several months of therapy, John has stopped fighting in bars. He doesn't have the nightmares nearly as much as he did. He's less attracted to Superman fantasies of power to numb his pain. But something more powerful is happening in his life than has ever happened before, and it's happening between us. And it has nothing to do with Superman and Darth Vader. It has everything to do with the authority of a relationship. He's allowing himself to surrender, and surrender to him has never been a good word. Surrender to him was always for the weak. But there is a surrender to love that is the source of the greatest power on earth. John originally hired me to help him get into better control of his life, and it turns out I helped him to surrender control to find a better one. Jesus was not big on control. He said, whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. Healing power does not come from control, but from surrender. John's power of control was never going to heal his fears. And only by surrendering control could he experience the power of authority that comes through a relationship. Now, if you go to Amazon.com and you type in power, most of the books that are going to come up are about control. Now, they don't tell you that, they just say power, because we're not defining what that means. But if you go to Amazon.com and as I have done, type in the word power, The number one best-selling book is called The 48 Laws of Power by a guy named Robert Greene. Robert Greene did an extensive study, politically and historically, of how people have behaved over the last several hundred years, and he came up with what he believes are the 48 laws for power, what it means to be a powerful person. Here are his laws to power. Greene says, never outshine the master for fear of retribution. Jesus said, trust God. Greene says, never put too much trust in friends. Learn to use your enemies. Jesus says, I have called you friends. Greene says, conceal your intentions. Jesus says, preach the gospel everywhere. Greene's law number 7, get others to do the work for you, but always take the credit. Jesus said, blessed are the humble. Greene says, law number 12, these are literally in his book, use selective honesty and generosity to disarm your victim. Jesus said, give it as it has been given unto you. Greene says, this is law number 14, pose as a friend, work as a spy. Jesus says, I am the Lamb of God. Greene says, law number 15, I love this one, crush your enemy totally. And of course, Jesus said, love your enemies. Right? Now, if you did not understand the difference between control and authority, you'd be very confused by that, wouldn't you? How could Jesus, who violates all 48 laws of power, be the most influential figure in all of history? There are over 2 billion Christians following him today, and if you include the Muslims, who consider him one of the greatest teachers in all of history, there are over 3 billion people who follow the teachings of Jesus today, and he violated all of the 48 laws of power. How does that make sense? Because there's a different form of power than controlling other people. Control is only one form of power. Jesus had a form of power that transcends the individual self. He's not interested in controlling anyone. Jesus doesn't control people, so he's not going to look like power in Greene's sense. He didn't use his miracles to control people. He didn't use his power for his own personal benefit. He didn't even believe in hierarchical structures where men are better than women or Jews are better than Greeks. He didn't believe in those kinds of control mechanisms or use of power in that way. Now, as I said, there's a time for control, there's a time for miracles, there's a time to set limits, there's a time for boundaries. But why is control overwhelmingly the most popular form of power? Why is it that people want to buy books about control? Why so much? If really authority, living with authority in relationship is the more powerful way to live, as Jesus has demonstrated for us, why do people want control? Well, the answer is that people are afraid. And fear makes you want control. Fear that drives you towards control drives you towards a dysfunctional life. John was afraid. He was desperately afraid, and desperately, because he was afraid, trying to keep control. It was his fear that made him need to be so controlling. Control is an attempt to avoid pain. Control can self-medicate us from our fears. And so we want control. But the reason we want control is because we are afraid. Fear makes people more controlling. They are motivated for self-preservation, and they want control to do that. They become concrete and narrow-minded when they're afraid. But there is no growth in fear. Control cannot heal fear, and fear only makes people more controlling. So once you go down that path where you use control of other people to deal with your fears, you just want more control because it doesn't change. It doesn't heal your fear. And once you control this person and control that person and crush that enemy, you've got to keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it because you're just trying to quiet your own fear. But there's a second reason why people want control. People also want control because of pride. Let me give you an example. I'll kind of rush through it. A man named Ian. Ian always tries to be in control. This is an example from my caseload. Of course, the names I change. He's well respected at his job. He's a business leader. He's a leader in his church. Everyone respects Ian, and he looks like he has a pretty good life because he's always in control, always looks good, always acts good. Makes me look good because he comes into my waiting room and he looks so good, people think, this must be a good psychologist. This guy looks good. But it's because he's so controlling. Everything has to look perfect. But everything is not always on the inside as it looks on the outside. Ian came because he was plagued by very disturbing thoughts. He was grateful for his life in many ways because he was very successful. But nobody knew that sometimes he actually had suicidal thoughts. He said, I was driving home from work a few weeks ago when it first happened. And I said, well, tell me about it. He said, well, I had just landed a very large project at work, and a lot of people depend on me to bring in projects like this. So I was relieved to get the work, but not looking forward to it at all because it was going to take a lot to get it done. And then I got the call from my wife. She had taken our oldest son to the neurologist, and they found he has an abnormal EEG, and the neurologist says he's epileptic. Epileptic. Just saying the word makes me feel like someone punched me in the stomach. I said, you must have been stunned. He said, you can say that again. And then it happened, and I said, what happened? He said, my first bad thought. I said, what was the thought? He said, that maybe they'd all just be better if I wasn't here. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, maybe I should just drive off the road and right into the oncoming traffic. And he was looking down. He said, maybe they'd all be better. Can you think of it? Me thinking that I should just kill myself. He was embarrassed to admit it, but he had these thoughts of dying, not actually because he was suicidal, but because he was so controlling. He believed that he needed to stay in control at all costs. He was raised in a very strict family where he was seen but not heard. And in order for him to be acceptable to his parents, he had to be perfect. So he was the perfect little boy. Anything they would want him to do, he would do it perfectly. He always kept his room clean. And we all want our children to do good things. Believe me, I have children. I want them to be good. But when they're required to be perfect, it becomes a very burdensome task. When your self-esteem depends on perfectionism, the basis of your self-worth is very tenuous. Ian's suicidal thoughts were overwhelming because he felt like he needed everything to be perfect. And the reason that he became suicidal is not just because of how crushing it was that he loved his son and his son now was epileptic, but it was because he believed everything needed to be perfect, even his children needed to be perfect, and when there were flaws in his children, it made him feel flawed. And the reason he got a suicidal thought is because I can't control this. He's out of my control. I can't control whether or not my son has epilepsy. What can I control? I can control whether or not I live or die. And at times, actually, suicidal ideation is an attempt to control. You can control that. You can control whether or not you live or die. It's an ultimate issue with control, not that he actually wanted to die. Ian had an over-concern with what people thought about him, an over-concern with how he was viewed by others, and this extended to his children. And this over-concern we call pride. Now, there's pride in a healthy sense, there's ambition that's good, but pride that's an over-focus on oneself, as the Bible talks about it, is not. Pride, when it takes the form of perfectionism, actually is the sign of low self-esteem, not high self-esteem. He was raised with too big of an influence on his appearance in order to feel good about himself, and that is a shaky basis for one's self-esteem. Jesus said, what good will it be if a man gains the whole world and yet forfeits his soul? An overemphasis on performance is not going to get you much in life. It may get you material things, but it may cost you your soul in the process. Well, it wasn't easy for Ian, but he began to surrender his need for control with me. Instead of telling me about his performance, which he did when he first started therapy, well, I did this and I did that today, he started sharing with me his failures. He started being honest with me. And by surrendering his power of control, he entered into a relationship of authority with me. And paradoxically, instead of feeling worse about himself because he was admitting all the things that he had failed, he actually felt better about himself because he was being honest for the first time with another human being. And the power of authority comes through an honest relationship. So he began to experience a different kind of power. The power that comes from being honest, the power that comes from living authentically, the power that can only come through the authority of a relationship. By surrendering control, John is giving up his perfectionism. And when bad things happen to him that were out of his control, he doesn't feel so much like a failure anymore because he doesn't have all his eggs in that basket. It's not just about doing things well that makes him feel good. It's about knowing that he's an honest person with the people that he loves that makes him feel good about himself. So he has a more balanced sense of self-esteem. The power of control cannot help you have good relationships. But good relationships are the only way for you to have the power of authority with other people. The power of authority only comes through love. Ian is living with this power of authority much more these days. His relationship with God is more powerful. His relationship with his wife is more powerful. His relationship with his friends are more powerful, and it's a more satisfying way for him to live. You know, just before Jesus began his ministry, he was taken into the desert by Satan. Jesus was hungry, so the tempter tried to seduce him with food. He said, "Here, turn these rocks into bread if you're hungry." Satan is very skilled at controlling you through your basic needs. Very skilled at trying to get you to do what he wants you to do by seducing you through these basic needs. But Jesus said man doesn't live by bread alone. He turned him down. There are worse things in life than death. I've had patients say this to me. I had a patient say this to me just a few weeks ago, a woman who was suicidally depressed early in our treatment, and she's recovered from that and now is struggling with cancer. And she's facing it with amazing courage, and people are always amazed at, how can you be so courageous in the way you're facing your cancer? And she says, it's not whether or not you die that's the issue, it's whether or not you lose the courage to live that's the issue in life. And once you've faced debilitating depression and come through the other side, you're ready to face anything. We do not live by bread alone. We have the ability to live for something much greater than that. Well, Jesus was then tempted by Satan to throw himself off the mountain and watch God save him. And Jesus said, "Don't put the Lord your God to the test." He was not afraid. Jesus was not afraid. So Satan couldn't tempt him with fear to try to do anything great like that. And then the tempter took him up to the highest mountain. He said to him, "Look, if you bow down to me, I'll give you control over the entire world." And Satan thought, that's got to be it. Isn't that the desire of every single person, to have control over the entire planet? Wouldn't Jesus want that? But Jesus turned him down because Jesus didn't have an ounce of pride in him either. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't prideful. So he wasn't interested in control. He didn't want to control other people. The power that Jesus has was through his relationships with God and others. And that authority is a personal power that transforms us from the inside out. Personal power is only mediated through relationship. Personal power only comes through love. And love that comes from God is the most powerful transforming force in the universe. You know, I think about this passage in the Bible and I wonder why this is there. You know, why did they tell this story? And the theological interpretation is, well, Jesus was to choose good, not evil. He was to choose to follow God, not Satan. And I think that's true, but I think it was also modeling for us power. Is the goal of life really to be in control? Is the goal of life to have everything? Is the goal of life to have all the stuff you want? To be able to live forever, or be in control of everything? Is that your goal? We all face that same question that Jesus faced in the desert, but he was modeling for us the answer. No, those things are not true power. Those things might be symbols of control and achievement, but they have nothing to do with the authority that can only come through powerful relationships. Psychology is understanding this now. We're understanding the healing power that is mediated only through authority and relationships. Jesus lived this way 2,000 years ago, and I think we're still learning from his example today. The subject of power is confusing. But I think we have to understand it in order to know how we're going to conduct ourselves in our relationships today. In psychology now, we don't talk about the survival of the fittest anymore. We talk about the survival of the fittest species. There is no individual survival anymore in psychology. We think about how is it we're going to live together and be powerful, not by one's self. That kind of power we don't think about in psychology anymore. Jesus said the kingdom of God is not a matter of talk, but of power. We are to live powerful lives. I think we can only do that if we are connected to the love of God and we mediate that love in our relationships with other people. This gives us authority in our relationships. I believe this is the most healing and most powerful way to live. Well, I'm going to conclude my thoughts there before they turn out the lights on me. And I know we're going to have a chance for questions in just a few minutes. Thank you very much.